here I have with me today Joel Bocko, who runs a blog called Lost in the Movies, primarily lately covering Twin Peaks and is one of my favorite blogs. Welcome, Joel.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice for you to say.
In the very dense landscape right now of different podcasts and blog posts and people writing up the new Twin Peaks, which is just recently finished, and of course, like I'm a huge Twin Peaks and David Lynch fan, so I wanted to do an episode of this podcast about just talking about David Lynch in general because he's one of my favorite, if not my favorite artist alive today. Um, but yeah, so you're also a filmmaker, correct?
Yes, the last short film that I made was a while ago, 3 or 4 years ago, or something like that. And actually, it's interesting because I've done a lot of video essays since then, and it resembles in a lot of ways a video essay because it's like a sort of a fake documentary. I don't want to call it mockumentary because that makes it sound funny, and it's definitely not not like it's has very little humor in it, which I kind of regretted, but kind of fit the tone of it. But it's sort of a made-up documentary using a lot of still photos and stuff like that, and with a narration. So it actually kind of it's weird. It almost kind of anticipated a lot of like the video essay work I ended up doing.
So did you go to school for film, or how did you get started doing stuff with film?
Well, I got started like really early, almost like too early, I feel like sometimes, because it's like maybe like my interest in film almost like peaked too early as like a little kid, when I couldn't do that much about it except kind of make, little films with a video camera or something. But I was into it as a little kid. I did study it in school, and it's funny, like that was a time when I got much more into music, and I wasn't really watching hardly any movies at all. And then afterwards, I kind of got back into it. It was almost like this weird interim where like my passion actually kind of ebbed a little bit for movies. But then afterwards, I think in 2008, I started my blog just really as an outlet for wanting to, because I was watching so many movies. It's just like I wanted to kind of talk about them somewhere.
Mm.
And that kind of grew, and I was able to kind of dabble around in different forms. A lot of like image posts where I'd sort of do like screen caps from a movie, and then video essays over time, and lists and various little sort of mini series things and stuff like that.
Mm.
So
And I think
around yeah, sorry.
there was a lot of stuff like that around the time, from what I recall too, or at least like I was on this forum, which I guess is, I don't know what it's called now. I think it's called Mubi or something like that. But yeah, it used to be called the Auteurs, and I was on that forum, and like yeah, I guess that's just in general the period of blogs being like super popular online. But anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, it's been an interesting landscape now that it's been almost 10 years to kind of look back at the changes. I feel like there was much more of a sense of a community of movie blogs around the sort of the turn of the decade. And then I think that got dissipated maybe into like social media platforms to a certain extent. It just seems like the blogs themselves became either less active, or you'd go read it, but the conversations would take place elsewhere on like Twitter or something like that. So it's sort of shifted over time. And like I was saying, the most popular things I've done are the YouTube videos, and and people find them like on YouTube usually. Like they'll come to the blog because they found the videos or something like that, versus finding the blog and then seeing the videos through that. So there's been sort of an interesting shift in that. Like I still find having like a site as a hub is really helpful for me, at least, to kind of organize my material and kind of present it and everything. But it doesn't seem to, like the activity will come to it from other platforms, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that is how, I guess that's the expected mode of engagement now. But
Yeah.
it's kind of the same thing I've noticed from talking to a lot of people who were involved with music around the turn of the last
Mm.
decade, where music blogs had a really big part in also breaking new artists and writing about things that were not getting written about before. They oftentimes posted albums and stuff, which of course would get takedowns and stuff. But I remember following like music blogs and downloading a bunch of albums from them, just stuff that I'd never heard of. And I feel like that stuff helped get exposure out to a lot of different things. But after a certain point, it seems like the platforms either kind of corporatized more, sort of became more centralized, or they just kind of stopped updating. Um, and I don't know. I guess that's a bummer for me because when I'm like thinking about, so the new season of Twin Peaks just finished, I guess, a week and a half ago, and every platform, every outlet that you can think of is, of course, writing TV recaps as they do now.
Hmm.
Um, but the thing that I really miss from a lot of those, and the thing that I really liked about your recaps on your website was that, well, one, you are somebody who has seriously analyzed David Lynch's work, has thought about it very deeply, and is sort of delivering your impressions and your thoughts in the context of that, in the context of somebody who's obviously like, a big movie nerd and a big Lynch person, so you're going into more depth and detail. But the majority of a lot of these recaps for me, as good as some of them are, don't really get into that because people are writing things really quickly after the episode, and it's really, I don't know. I guess I have some frustration with that whole way of delivering information because it seems like it only rewards very sort of shallow and quick analysis of things. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on the whole recap thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon because for me, this was, I guess, the second time that I ever kind of took. Yeah, I think probably the second time I took this approach because I've covered a few TV shows on the site with episode guides, but it's usually like older shows that I'm catching up with. So the first time that I actually watched a show live and wrote about it, I don't know if I wrote about it that night as I have with Twin Peaks or if it was the next day, but it was like within a day or two, was the second season of True Detective, which was sort of ignominious in a lot of ways. But this was really only the second time that I kind of took that approach. And because I really am not that much of a regular TV watcher, I was never really keeping up with a lot of recappers. And it's interesting too, because I mean, I hear recapper and I think plot summary more, just because I
Yeah.
mean that's literally what recap means, which was never really my main interest with what I was writing. There were a few where I sort of went into summaries, but for the most part it was more I just chose the things I wanted to talk about. I knew people had seen it. That's the one thing I don't think I quite understand about the concept of recapping. I mean, it implies to me, maybe it's a misunderstanding, that you're summing up what people just saw, like describing almost what people just saw. So I guess I'm not sure what the function of that is really, unless there's a good deal of analysis in it, which
Well,
maybe there is. Maybe recap is a misnomer.
well, yeah, I think it's specifically for TV shows, maybe something where you want a quick analysis, either because you were only sort of watching it or you didn't watch it and just want, a quick summary, um, or something like that. But the thing is,
Hmm.
like, it seems like most people who are reading those recaps are doing so because they're watching the series. Because
Yeah.
otherwise, like, why would I want to read about Twin Peaks episode 15, if I haven't seen the
Yeah.
first 14 episodes?
Yeah.
But and so that seems to hint to me that, like, for me, I want a way to sort of process and think about the thing that I've watched, but the format for recaps doesn't really lend itself to that.
Mm.
And I know that, like, a lot of the discussion about these things, it either happens on Twitter or it happens in some forums and stuff like that. But I guess it bums me out specifically with something like Twin Peaks, where there are so many different themes, so many different
Yeah.
things being handled, and the primary form in which people are sort of digesting and talking about it are through these recaps, which are not really able to get at, the more serious ideas or themes that I feel like,
hmm
you've been handling in your blog posts and things like that.
Yeah, I can see how that form would be, especially when it is more focused on just sort of summary, how that would be kind of not that helpful. I think in terms of it's interesting in terms of like how I engaged personally with Twin Peaks throughout this season. I had kind of planned to like read everything and partake in everything, and it was just so impossible. There was just so much. And so what I ended up kind of doing was just listening to a handful of podcasts, mostly sticking to one forum just because the other ones were so busy. It was like
Mm.
I couldn't keep tabs on everything, so I kind of stopped keeping tabs on anything. So I would follow the Twin Peaks Rewatch podcasts forum because they had enough activity that it was pretty busy, but you could actually keep up with it. And
Mm.
then the conversations I had were mostly on Twitter, I would say. And that was kind of how I engaged. So I kind of missed out on a lot of the writing. I'm probably going to go back and read some of it now. I'm sure some of it will probably be less interesting just because so much
Yeah.
is speculatory and now
Yeah.
we know. So
Yeah, exactly.
that loses its bite.
Yeah, I think that's the other frustration with it is that it's designed to be disposable. Like once you go back and you see the speculation, sometimes it can be useful, but a lot of times it really doesn't, I don't know, like I often feel like it just doesn't go anywhere. Like a lot of the I mean, I guess there are a lot of things that seemed obvious about the new Twin Peaks that now, that didn't seem obvious at the time.
Mm.
But it can be hard to go back and see those things now of like people being like, wow, these people were way off. Or it was like speculation about details that didn't end up really being that important. Like, oh, X character is going to be doing X thing now. And it's like, does that really matter that much in the grand scheme of things, Or is that kind of a fan revisiting nostalgia, which of course, as we talk about the new series,
hmm
we can say that's not what the series is at all. Um, but so I guess I want to go back and ask you just what got you into Twin Peaks and David Lynch's work specifically.
David Lynch, I think like a lot of people sort of my generation, it was Mulholland Drive that really sort of took me into the Lynchverse. I'd
Actually,
seen Elephant Man as a kid,
me too, actually. Yeah.
but Mulholland Drive, I was about 18 when that came out. I didn't see it in theaters, but I saw it like immediately after, within a year on DVD. And it was like one of those films that everybody who was like sort of into film would talk. It was like especially younger people. It's like they had like maybe 6 DVDs on their shelf. It would be like Pulp Fiction, like, Donnie Darko or something, Reservoir Dogs. Like there was just this certain
Memento.
thing. Memento, yep. And then Fight Club maybe, and like Mulholland Drive was one of those
Yeah.
films.
Well, it's
I
one
would
of
say
those
probably
like
the best of that bunch.
one of those like
But yeah,
edgy American turn of the century films.
yes, yeah, totally. So I saw that and I was just totally swept up in it and loved it. And but then I didn't see that many Lynch films for many years. I saw Blue Velvet, and it was actually right at the time that I started the blog, literally maybe even the same day or like no, it was I think a like literally a week earlier or something. I rented Twin Peaks from Netflix and I started watching it as I was beginning to blog. And I didn't blog about it. I was writing about movies and sort of said, well, when I finish Twin Peaks, I'll write up my thoughts at the end. And then I did that, and then the only part I reviewed sort of right after seeing it was Firewalk with Me. And then I remember I watched the special features DVD, and they had like the making of special, and they're showing them like build all the sets and sort of the ups and downs. And that more than anything got me like, I want to watch this again now and like see it all in context. That feeling of like when you finish Twin Peaks and it's sort of this messy roller coaster of a journey, but then you want to go back and like almost like make sense of it in a way, or just re-experience that ride.
Yeah.
I did that, and I wrote up each episode, but I stopped at Leland's death and the end of the mystery.
Yeah. Well,
Because,
For me, when I watched the series for the first time, I could tell that the series had dropped off, and I didn't even need anyone to tell me that the series had dropped off.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious.
It was the old man at the funeral that did it for me. Like when that happened, something clicked in my head and I went, oh my God, they're going to make this like a quirky sitcom now. Like I didn't
Yeah.
expect it to do that. And the second it did, I was like, oh no. But at that point, I had switched, all of the DVD queues on Netflix to Twin Peaks. So I was getting like I was just binging it at that point because I wanted to see what happened next. So luckily that kind of got me through that rough patch. And then, to the finale, which I thought was kind of mind-blowing and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I also got in to Lynch from Mulholland Drive. Actually, the first movie that I saw of his was Lost Highway, and I just did not get it.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
I think I had watched it because I was in college, and somebody had actually done an opera based on. They had written an opera based
Yeah,
on,
I heard about that.
yeah, Lost Highway, and it was like I didn't see it, but everyone was talking about Lost Highway. So like, I watched it with like my roommate and a few other people,
Hmm.
and I just remember it being very dark and confused, like dark also just like,
Mm.
dark in terms of like I couldn't see like half of the shots. Um, or it was just really confusing and I didn't really get it, and like and then I decided we had these classes in school where students could teach their own classes, like so if you had something that you wanted to sort of offer a course in something that we didn't have a class in, like in the cinema department, then you could teach that. So I took one for David Lynch, and I also took another one for Terry Gilliam that
Mm.
were both taught by students, because I was just trying to like watch a bunch of different filmmakers and stuff like that, because I had gotten really into film and was just like binging on film. I sort of had the opposite experience of you in that like I got really into film in college and then kind of uh,
Interesting.
yeah, and then sort of petered out. But because we had like a college library, so I just
Hmm.
rented all the DVDs and everything. Got to see a lot of things that I wouldn't get to see normally. But yeah, I liked his stuff, but I wasn't sure about it until I saw Mulholland Drive, and that was the first movie that I saw of his that I was really like really hit me in a really deep and difficult place. Um, and I remember like I watched three movies that day, but that was the movie that like I watched Rosemary's Baby, and
Hmm.
that like the same day for the first time, and then
Wow.
I also watched The Ring, and then I watched that movie.
Two
Um,
Naomi Watts movies.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But that movie I just couldn't, it just never really got
Yeah.
out of my head. So I got into his work through there, and I've been obsessed since then. But I actually didn't really like Twin Peaks that much. It didn't seem particularly. It seemed like a '90s show, and it was
Yeah.
like I kind of felt like I don't want to see David Lynch or David Lynch and Mark Frost, doing this kind of 90s show. I want to see him doing something really weird, and you only got to see like little glimpses of the weird stuff in the show. Like, I mean, I obviously loved the Red Room sequence from the original series and all that stuff, but
Hmm.
I just didn't really. I don't know. I didn't really like it didn't really do much for me until later on, I guess, until rewatching it.
Yeah, I remember actually a couple years before I watched it on Netflix. I tried to rent it from Netflix, but the gold box hadn't come out yet, so there was no pilot available. So I had to start with episode one.
When did the Gold
And
Box come out? Was that
2007, I think.
okay? Because that's
Yeah.
around the time that I watched the series. Because I think
Okay.
my friend had the Gold Box. I think that's why.
So yeah, I think in 2006 I tried to watch Twin Peaks, but I had to start with quote unquote episode one, which is actually the first episode after the pilot.
Yeah.
And I remember having a similar impression of you, just kind of like, oh, I don't know, this is kind of an early 90s soap opera. Like it's a little bit, looks a little stagey, the sets and the lighting's a bit, 90s and stuff, and the cuts. Like I remember specifically the scene of Bobby and Mike in the jail cell, and just kind of being like, I don't know, I don't know
Is
about
that the
this.
one where they're going like, whoo,
It's
like?
after that. They do
Oh,
that in the
okay,
pilot, I think, and I couldn't see the
okay.
pilot, so I was jumping. And it wasn't directed by Lynch, this episode. So it's
Hmm.
kind of like, I don't know if this is. So is this just something like Lynch executive produced and didn't actually wasn't that involved with? I don't know. But then there was one moment where Sarah is screaming and she sees that shot of Bob,
Yeah,
and that's like, because that felt just like, even though Lynch didn't direct that episode, it was sort of based on something that happened when they shot the pilot, and it was like,
yeah.
which I didn't know at the time, but it was like, oh, this feels just like Mulholland Drive, like the man behind the diner. Like I think I yelled out, and my roommate had to like run it, like what's going on? I was like, oh my god, this is like, I'm watching this thing, and just the fact that he was so out of place, like there was no reason to be cutting from this sort of domestic scene of like grief to like a long-haired man staring at the camera crouched behind a bed. It was terrifying. And so I was like, okay, this is going to be interesting. And then the next episode starts with the Horn family at like the table, and they're just eating, and it's like a
Oh,
3
that's the
scene.
one with the like the where they're eating the baguettes.
Yeah, and I was like, and even before his name came up, I'm like, okay, this one was directed by David Lynch, and like that episode just won me over. But I waited 2 years to watch it because I was like, well, I need to see the pilot. Like, I need to see what starts this whole mystery off and everything. So I kind of forestalled it. But yeah, I remember having that same impression at first, but then the sort of the Lynchisms like won me over.
Yeah, I have a question for you, and I know this is like a difficult question to answer and probably one that's been asked like a billion times, but what do you think it was about Twin Peaks that made it one, such a massively popular series that also attracted a huge backlash,
Hmm.
fairly quickly?
Yeah.
And two, what do you think accounts for why the fan community has been so strong for so long and is probably almost certainly the reason why we have Twin Peaks season 3 25 years later. But yeah, so
Yeah, great question. I think it's all sort of related because the thing that sort of makes Twin Peaks unique and gives it a wider audience than probably some of Lynch's film work is that it's like this weird cross section of certain conventions and then things that just don't fit those conventions at all. And because it kind of has that grounding in some things that are familiar, it sort of lures people in who are like intrigued by the mystery or the atmosphere of the woods or just this, and then they get sort of fed this strangeness as well, and people love that. Now the thing is, Twin Peaks is never all just one thing. I think it's always in flux, and I think um, I think it forms a coherent whole in the end, but that's almost like despite its messiness. And I think it's sort of a mistake that people sometimes make is, and I've actually been having this argument a lot on Twitter lately in the past few days, is this idea that it's like, well, Twin Peaks is sort of this one thing and then it changes. And lately that's become, well, either the return as a whole or specifically the last couple episodes, like, oh, this is not my Twin Peaks, like, da, da, da. And, if somebody's turned off or they're upset or something's not clicking for them, like I have some sympathy with that, but I think people sometimes react without thinking of the wider context that Twin Peaks has always done this.
yeah.
Always. There's been so many points where a big chunk of the audience broke off and said, "I'm done. This is enough. I can't take this anymore." And then others stuck around, and then it splintered further at another
Yeah.
point, and it's just happened so many times. It's really in its DNA to and it's all, well, it's usually because Lynch in particular is taking it further in the direction, further away from that sort of straightforward premise with
The
just the
the
hint of the
coffee
eerie.
and yeah, the coffee and the cherry pie and the woodsiness and the, the sort of comforting music and all that stuff is very like Twin Peaks, but it's also the um kind
It's
of
the safer side of it in
yeah,
a
it's like
way.
kind of the blanketing nostalgia around it, which I
Yeah.
think I'm more receptive to that now. I think at the
Yeah, me
time
too.
because like now I see people I've also seen people be like, well, like you're not really watching Twin Peaks if that's what you like about Twin Peaks. But there's also part of me that's like, when I have watched the new series, I do miss, there's something like, and I think it is just a very like 90s, early 90s, late 80s sort of its time thing.
Hmm.
There's kind of like a claustrophobia to the original Twin Peaks in a way that is kind of like weirdly comforting or
Yeah,
something. Like it's always kind of within a convention. And I think that's the thing about soap opera in general, which Twin Peaks really is a
yeah,
soap opera, um, is like there's an intentionally kind of fabricated thing, and it's fabricated to be kind of both comforting and reassuring in a lot of ways, and also kind of a good vehicle for drama and stuff, but in this way that is very kind of fake or whatever. But that's not a bad thing. And as weird as it seems, I think that kind of thing might seem more fresh today in some ways, just
yeah.
because it's
Good
so
point.
yeah, because it's so different from prestige TV and even like reality TV and
Yeah.
stuff like that. That it just, but yeah, I mean, we can talk about prestige TV in a bit, but I guess one of the real sticking points for Twin Peaks, and really like the thing that has been at the central focus of your analysis, is the movie Fire Walk with Me, which for a very long time I didn't watch because people told me that it was not a good film. Some people called it at the time, I think, like the worst film ever made.
Yeah,
There was a
it's
critic that
amazing.
and then, like, which also somebody said about Showgirls, which is also one of my favorite movies, and also has Kyle MacLachlan in
Yeah,
it.
I was
But
just gonna say
um,
the two
uh,
movies he made at the time that probably was like, oh God, why did I got these two bombs and blah blah blah. And now it's like those are probably his most talked about films of that period.
yeah, absolutely. And like, I remember Quentin Tarantino was like, he watched I read some quote where he watched Fire Walk with Me, and he's like, I'm so done with David Lynch. Like, I'm just so frustrated with him and stuff. And apparently Fire Walk with Me got booed at the Cannes Film Festival or something. I think that's correct.
Yeah, and I think Tarantino's exact quote was that David Lynch has gone so far up his own ass that I don't care if I ever see another Lynch film again. It's like, of all the people to say that, I enjoy Tarantino's work, but come on. Like, if there's any filmmaker who's up his own ass, I think, he might fit that category a little better than David Lynch. So that always kind of amused me.
Yes. So why do you think people responded that way at the time?
It's I guess it's a tough question to unpack, but fortunately I have unpacked it quite a bit, so I guess I have some stuff to kind of draw on in terms of references. Um, in the video that I made that we were talking about earlier, the 7 facts about Firewalk with Me, the very first one is that the media and the critics had turned on Twin Peaks in 1992. Like, it was an unpopular item, and as was David Lynch. And I think that does have to be foregrounded to a certain extent. Is there are specifics as to why people hated Firewalk with Me, but they also hated Twin Peaks at this time.
Mm.
There was just like such a backlash against that show.
Was this because
The
of
Lynch in
season
particular.
two?
Yeah, it was because of season 2, and just because people got lured into Lynch's world, and you see this happening again. I mean, like, as we speak, this is happening again for many people. It's just like it's a never-ending cycle with him, and it's kind of fascinating. It's that thing we are talking about, where because he uses certain conventions, and he uses, particularly in this case, narrative conventions that lead you to expect a certain thing, and then he plays with them in interesting ways where he just doesn't fulfill them the way you'd expect them to be fulfilled or at the pace. And people just started to feel like he was this like And plus that combined with his persona where he's just this sort of aw shucks guy and
And he won't say things in
oh
interviews, like people
yeah,
ask him
absolutely
questions,
not.
and yeah.
So for a while he was like this cool like icon. Like it's amazing for me to look back at like the stuff from 1990. He's got all these pictures with like Isabella Rossellini and he's like almost this like fashion icon or something, like America's favorite, Jimmy Stewart surrealist or something. But people just got annoyed because he wouldn't give them what they wanted in return. And you just see this massive shift of the tide. And it happens very early in the second season. It actually happens with the premiere episode, which a lot of people...
Which is one of the best episodes of
Yeah,
Twin
it's
Peaks.
many people's like favorite episode or one of their favorites. And it's like right away before they even revealed the killer, people were dropping like flies. The ratings were plummeting. They put them on a Saturday. The critics were all turned against it. So to get back to the question about Firewalk with Me, there's a great article. I just collected all these quotes on my site. It's on this article called Gone Fishing, which you can find in any of, there's like Twin Peaks directories and stuff like that on the site, so you can kind of navigate to it. But I gathered like over 100 snippets that I sort of was researching in this short period. And one of them is like a party in like 92, like a premiere party in LA. And it's like the reporter's like, yeah, I walked into the bar and there's Twin Peaks bunting. And I was like, man, that show was only 2 years ago. That feels like nostalgia already. Like that was like that was such a fad like way back when. So it's like there's this spirit of like real anger at Lynch. And then, so that would have been happening anyways. But then you take this particular film and the fact that he took the show, which sort of teased around the edges of these detective tropes and somewhat subverted them, but still kind of...
So can we just can we stop for a second? I just want to say, Twin Peaks is about Laura Palmer, who's a teenager who's been murdered, and we're trying to figure out who killed her, right? And so obviously her life in the series in Twin Peaks, you only hear about from the side, and you see all the sort of effects that it's had on people, but you don't really understand her as a character. And
Yep.
obviously, with Firewalk with Me, she becomes a character.
Right. It's a prequel in which it's all about her life, and the detective who was our guide into that world is now relegated to a pretty small supporting role, even smaller. It was intended to be small, and then it was made even smaller by Kyle MacLachlan's kind of on and off again involvement with it. Now, also, I should say, I guess if people are listening to this and haven't seen Twin Peaks, you should probably put a spoiler warning at the beginning. I've actually already said something that's
Yeah.
a spoiler.
I mean,
I was
I
talking about the episode that changes the series, but
oh yeah. I mean, I'm okay with spoiling the first Twin Peaks more than I want to put the big warnings before
yeah,
we talk about the new Twin Peaks. But I want to get some of this stuff out of the way just in case someone's
yeah,
listening and they're curious about it or
yeah.
whatever.
So with Firewalk with Me, the fact that he made it about Laura, there's just so many things about that make it such a subversive, radical gesture. First of all, you have this genre that's sort of a male-oriented genre of like the detective and this beautiful dead girl, and he's trying to get to her secrets and this and that, and they flip it on its head where suddenly the dead girl is alive and it's her story, and it's a story of the victim, not of the redemptive hero. And that's already kind of really something that's uncomfortable for a lot of people to watch. And then on top of that, her specific trauma was incest, and the film delves directly into that, and in a way that's a bit less... the series obscures it a little bit because you have the supernatural element of Bob, who possesses her father, and the episode in which he dies, they really, in my opinion, they lean kind of heavily on this idea that he's like a puppet of this spirit, and he couldn't help
Yeah,
himself.
absolutely.
And it really plays on that in an episode that, interestingly, is not directed or written by Lynch. So in the film, although he keeps the spirit around, and that's still part of it, he really... just the overall presentation of Leland in that film makes him seem much more culpable and much more aware of and responsible for the abuse of Laura. And it just highlights, I think there's one sort of throwaway line in the series which lets you know she was abused by Bob and hence her father. But the film is all about that. And that's that is the mystery in the film is not, who killed Laura Palmer. It's Laura Palmer finding out what we already know but kind of knew from a distance, which is that the person who she's seen abusing her for all these years is actually her father.
Yeah.
So it
So
almost flips that dynamic on its head from the show, and that was obviously upsetting for people, especially if they came from Twin Peaks with the expectation that it was this quirky soap opera that was about the townspeople, and it mixed, some ominous dread with a lot of humor and stuff like that. And this was just pitched so differently that it, even for fans of the show, so there were all these people who hated Twin Peaks, but even among people who had stuck with Twin Peaks, this was quite a shocker. And of course, it doesn't resolve where the series left off, which is Cooper
yeah,
being
I think
in.
that might be part of the reason why people responded the way that they did, but it feels kind of fucked up to me in a way that a movie that is so sort of empathetic
Yes.
with its female character, much more so than because I feel like David Lynch, he gets a lot of shit about his treatment of women in movies, and it really like I think it. I mean, I will usually defend him, although I think it depends on which movie
Yeah.
and you're talking about, and I think he's got better over time. But I think Fire Walk with Me was his first movie where he really handled it particularly well. And I guess I want to talk about something pretty uncomfortable right here, right now, just because I have, unfortunately, a lot of personal experiences and personal trauma that are very similar to Laura. Like, I was also abused by my father,
Hmm.
um, and I will say from watching that movie, which I didn't see until probably 4 years ago, maybe the last Lynch movie that I saw because I didn't, it was
Hmm.
really difficult for me to deal with. Her My experiences with my father, who is very similar to Leland Palmer, unfortunately, like also a lawyer and also very similar sort of character,
Hmm.
is there are a few scenes in that movie that could have been ripped straight out of my life and out of my experiences. Like not like, any of the supernatural stuff, but just in his interactions with her. Like one scene, and it's very like little stuff. It's not even something that you would think about. But the fact that it is included in that movie, like in the midst
Hmm.
of all this other stuff, shows to me that like he understands this. There's like one scene where he's asking her to clean her fingernails, that her fingernails are like really dirty, and he's yelling at her to like wash her hands, and she's like freaking out, and she just kind of crying and stuff. Um, like, and you could read that as like his whole like thing as the murderer is that he would put like the letter under the fingernail and all that kind of stuff, so it's a reference to that. But like for me, that was an experience that I had where my dad would like look at my fingernails and tell me to watch, this kind of really weird obsessive behavior.
Hmm.
And then there's a couple other things I can't remember. Well, one of them was specifically later on in the film. One of the last times she sees Leland before she's killed is she just says to him, she's like, "Stay away from me," or something like that. I can't remember what the line is. Um, but the way that she says it, like I've said that exact, line to my father before, and like I, without getting into it too much, like these are experience. It's not really a fantasy. This isn't really a fantasy world for me anymore. It's like real life, and these are
Hmm.
things that I've experienced, and they're being depicted in a way that is like um kind of magical, and it has this whole thing about the spirit realm, and David Bowie comes out of nowhere and all that kind of stuff. But the fact is that like it deals with that in a way that is so accurate for me, and I think that really like needs to be understood, especially for people who say that he doesn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've heard a lot actually is people who have experienced that saying that this film is almost uncanny in tapping into that experience. And I think, yeah, it's really tough to see to see people react to it that way. I think where they just it's not even. I can almost understand the people who reject it, like or are upset by it, and that's how they respond. But the people who like refuse to empathize with it always that just really touched a nerve for me. And I think, yeah, a lot of survivors have written to Cheryl Lee and to David Lynch and told them that this film resonated in that way. And I think that's kind of like the haunting story and the legacy of Twin Peaks for all those years, and specifically Fire Walk with Me, is that
Yeah, sorry,
no, yeah, keep going.
Sorry.
Agreeing with that.
I also had a roommate who watched it with me, and she's not like an intellectual person, not like a real film person, but she said it was one of her favorite movies that she'd ever seen because
Interesting, yeah.
it was the most accurate, and it was the most accurate like capturing of demonic possession. She was like really into demonic possession. She's like, yeah,
Interesting.
she's like, yeah, Laura just let the demons get to her, and you can't let the. And I was like, I don't really know if that's what I got out of the movie,
Yeah.
but she really liked it. She's like, no,
Yeah.
this is the most accurate thing about demonic possession that I.
Wow,
And I'm
that's
like,
amazing.
oh, okay. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, no, it connects on this deep psychological level, and it was just like painful for me to see because I had some issues with the movie. It's interesting because my experience coming at it was sort of somewhat. My experience was coming at it as somebody who had not experienced abuse, but was very close to people who had been abused and who had abused them. So I almost feel like that kind of played in my response, where I almost felt kind of upset with the movie for including the stuff from the show at first. I was like, well, wait, why didn't he just drop the Twin Peaks stuff and make it the Laura Palmer story? Because clearly that was what moved him, but he left in the stuff with Bob and the lodges and all this. And I've noticed, interestingly, I haven't actually seen that many people who have experienced abuse directly actually take that offense, interestingly enough.
Well,
I don't know if
yeah.
it's your experience or not, but like it was something that struck me maybe because I had that kind of proximity without, it was like this feeling of like, it taps into that. I think it taps into a feeling of like anger or feeling like a wanting some sort of understanding or something of these situations and the way
Yeah.
everything, if that
Well,
makes sense.
it's putting it in a context of larger, I guess, spiritual events. It's like it's putting it's trying to capture something that I don't know. I think it's really remarkable, actually, and his work in general, because it's trying to capture something that really hasn't been captured, at least not by movies. And I think this is the thing that kind of makes me feel like Lynch he doesn't work. His movies don't work the same way that other filmmakers do. Like fundamentally, they're not the same. Because you can say a lot of because okay, so this is a big point for a lot of people. Is that I feel like I either see people say like, well, everyone's always trying to puzzle out Lynch's movies and try and, solve the puzzle and understand, and you can't solve the puzzle, and why do people try and do this? And I understand that. But then there are other people who will say like, no, that puzzle is really there is some sort of narrative puzzle here, and it's important to understanding the larger themes and the story, to understand that there are actually things going on here. And I think for me it's always kind of both, like both things are present. But I think the reason why a lot of people are uncomfortable dealing with the whole puzzle idea is because most film doesn't work that way. We're not taught to watch things that way. And we have to adjust the way that we look at things and the way our sort of expectations, the way that we view things. And there aren't very many signposts for that.
Yeah.
outside of maybe Lynch's work, I think the only other director, that I can think of that's as big as Lynch who does that kind of symbolic meaning is like Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe some of like surrealist directors and stuff, kind of way back in the earlier on. But
Hmm.
I think like there's something about his films that it is very constructed and it is very sort of you can't view it in the same way, and that's important because I think watching a movie like Fire Walk with Me that not just it doesn't just deal with like Laura Palmer's abuse and stuff, but also deals with this like bizarre spirit realm and all this other stuff, which ends up coming
Hmm.
up a lot more in the new series, is that once you sort of see these things,
Hmm.
like once you see them captured, it's kind of hard to put them back in their box and forget about them. And it kind of like, I mean, and this is how I feel again from watching new Twin Peaks is once you sort of watch this and you get really into it and start to understand it, you start to see how lacking a lot of other things are in
Yeah.
terms of dealing with those issues. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think with Lynch, it's an unusual phenomenon where it's like I agree. There's like these two extremes that I think you have to kind of balance between. Where it's like on the one hand, people say they almost turn him into sort of like a Christopher Nolan type puzzle director, where it's like this intellectual piecing, and he's really not that at all. On the other hand, though, I think people can go to the other extreme and just say it's just purely this sort of random sensory data, and you can't the patterns, you're just imposing the patterns upon it, and there's let yourself just go for the ride and don't question anything. I think that actually is a good way to kind of watch or maybe experience his films the first time, but I think upon revisiting, it's clear there are patterns there. There are connections, but his puzzles are emotional. They're not intellectual. So that's what makes him so unusual, I think, is he's creating these systems, but the systems are all based upon emotion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think identifying that and being able to talk about it is a difficulty among a
Yeah.
lot of people with Lynch's work. Today, like people still, I think, struggle with identifying that. And I guess it's something that I feel like I might be able to understand a little more as somebody who does things with like video games,
Mm.
which deal with systems a lot more and explicit puzzle solving and and it's funny that people mentioned a lot of people compared scenes in the new Twin Peaks to like old adventure games like Myst and things like that.
Hmm.
I don't know if you saw, like, I don't know, I feel like I saw that come up like
To miss. That's interesting. What aspect of it did they feel was like that?
some of the like the digital aesthetic, like especially
Okay.
a lot of the kind of like morphing and
Ah, okay.
like the scenes inside whatever you want to call the place, the White Lodge,
Yeah.
whatever the um things like that, yeah, that seemed very like kind of not like corny, but very obviously like digitally added effects.
Yeah.
Um, but there's also in a lot of those sort of old adventure games, and this is the thing that people would complain about a lot is the logic for the puzzles often didn't really make sense. Like sometimes, it would require one thing to solve one puzzle, but then another puzzle, like there would be a very bizarre solution. And oftentimes, maybe some of the solutions were driven by narrative logic or things like that. And oftentimes it was inconsistent in those games. And some of those games, a lot of those games had really bad puzzles. But the idea that like this kind of mystery box that you're approaching and you kind of have to understand something about it to actually get into it, I think is a really appealing one, and it's not something that you really get to see very often with movies or a TV show. Um,
Yeah, that's an interesting point, both from the graphic standpoint and from the sort of, I don't know if narrative is the right word, but that sort of standpoint as well. And I've never been that big of a gamer, so it's sort of more just sort of have a general sense of it. But it does seem like there was a lot of video game stuff going on in this series in a way that maybe wasn't present quite as much, or at least not in these ways in earlier Lynch films.
Yeah. So I guess before we get into just talking about Twin Peaks: The Return, I guess I just wanted to give a shout out to Inland Empire, which is still
Yeah.
my favorite David Lynch work, even with this new series, I think. And we'll talk about why
Hmm.
when we talk about Twin Peaks: The Return. But I think people who complained about some of the treatment of women in Twin Peaks: The Return, which I did have issues with when I was watching through the series, I think
Hmm.
now that I understand maybe a little bit more about what the series is about, I feel like I can understand that
Hmm.
more. But like Inland Empire specifically is something that I call a feminist film, and really is also like a really redemptive film in the way that
Yeah.
I guess Fire Walk with Me is too, but Inland Empire is really devoted to like this sort of some kind of mystical psychic journey that
Hmm.
really ends in acknowledging trauma and being able to move on from it in the way that is not resolved in the new Twin Peaks.
Totally agree. Yeah. It's such an interesting companion piece to The Return, I think. Um,
But so talking about the return, I don't know. I guess I should just ask, what are your sort of overall impressions with it after having seen all the episodes just a week or so after?
yeah, it's so much to digest. It's interesting. There's almost sort of like two different answers, which is my impression of it sort of as it was unfolding and my questions and doubts, and then where the finale kind of left me with all of that. And I feel like maybe I had a little bit of a reverse experience than a lot of other people, where they were like on board. They're like, this is gonna, go somewhere great and blah blah blah, and then they were kind of crushed by the finale and just how it left things and where it went, and dissatisfied. And I enjoyed the whole return, but I was a little worried at times because it feels quite different from a lot of late Lynch films to me, and in some ways almost a little bit. It's both an advance in certain ways and a throwback in certain ways. And part of me worried that my favorite Lynch films are some of the ones that you've talked about, basically the late Lynch films, the stuff that springs directly out of Twin Peaks, and particularly Firewalk with me. And I started to worry, it's like, well, is he just sort of past that phase and now into a new one that's sort of like, are we going to get that kind of, it's particularly structurally, it's like almost this sort of third act thing in all those movies where you just go off into this sort of dreamscape and the reality shifts and the characters and identities are all blurring and you're
I
just going to this fascinating dream place.
Yeah.
And I
I
got
guess I
that. I
guess
got that from the
yeah.
finale, so I loved it.
Yeah.
You
No,
know?
I loved the finale too. Honestly, and the finale is what made me be able to get back on board with the
Yeah.
series, because everyone was talking about episode 8 when it aired, and I still don't know how I feel about episode 8.
I
Honestly.
loved episode 8, but it almost exists outside of Twin Peaks to a certain extent for me. I think there are some interesting connections with the rest of the show, but for the most part, it feels like this phenomenon that's sort of separate from what the return does or doesn't do to a degree for me.
Yeah. So I watched back through the whole series
Hmm.
actually, because I think I was a little frustrated with, I love the last two episodes,
Yeah.
but a lot of the analysis online, because it's only been a week or so, has revolved around the last two
Yeah.
episodes and analyzing them. And, for me, I'm like, if this is really like Mulholland Drive style
Hmm.
thing, which I think that Twin Peaks: The Return reminds me more of Mulholland Drive than anything else,
Me too.
honestly,
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. And I think because Mulholland Drive was originally intended to be a series on TV, And also originally intended to be like a spin-off of Twin Peaks, right? Was that correct? Like, wasn't it supposed to be like about Audrey?
I think, yeah, like way back when they the first came up with the title and like sort of the idea of trying to make a show called that, it was going to be like Audrey Goes to Hollywood. And
Hmm.
then they never did it, but the idea kind of stuck around. So when someone or other came to him and was like, "Hey, ABC wants to do another show with you," that was sort of one of the ideas he grabbed.
Yeah. Well, see, I wonder how many of those ideas from Mulholland Drive
Hmm.
ended up getting transported over into this
Hmm.
new Twin Peaks because it's the first TV show that he's done since,
Yeah.
trying to do Mulholland Drive. Specifically, like the scenes in Las Vegas
Hmm.
just feels so much like Mulholland Drive to me in the sort of like kind of like weird, absurd, goofy humor, like a lot of kind of I mean, I guess there's more sort of like just very things that are very like constructed for TV, like they're very kind
Hmm.
of uh TV drama ridiculous things, but in kind of a surreal way.
Yeah.
Um a lot of the scenes particularly there was a scene in Mulholland Drive where the guy tries to do a hit on this other guy
Right.
to grab
Yeah.
a book and then it screws up. And there are like multiple scenes in Twin Peaks The Return that remind me of that scene. Um
Yeah, I agree totally. I think there's a lot of similarity between The Return and Mulholland Drive, structurally and just conceptually and stuff. And the Vegas stuff really is at the heart of that. And I mean, starring Naomi Watts is this sort of, but like her performance is pitched very much like the Betty part of Mulholland Drive.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
she even
that's true.
dresses a little like her at times. And so there's definitely the conscious links going on there.
Well, and it has the same sort of structure at the end where it turns very dark at the end and like
Yes. Yep.
watching the the series again. I just finished the last few episodes last night, and I think when I was watching the first time through 17 and 18, I kind of like you were just happy that Cooper is like back, even though all this other weird stuff is happening. So I think I was kind of still going with Cooper and following him
Hmm.
until that scene where he kind of just starts wandering around with the gun, like, and in the Judy's
Yeah.
uh, diner, and he's just acting really weird. And then going back and watching it again, I noticed that his character just for that whole episode
Yeah.
is off and a lot more kind of a jerk and like it started to make me see sort of I really sort of got to understand what the overall direction of the
Mm.
series was outside of like Cooper, wanting to follow Cooper and being really on his side. But the thing that I really liked about your analysis of the last two episodes is that you put Cooper front and center, which of course, it's hard to do anything else. But I think that the character for me, um, and I feel like this has been confirmed from watching through the series again, and there are
Hmm.
still things that I don't understand. I think like I don't feel comfortable saying that the entire series is like Cooper's dream, but
Hmm.
it's something like that. um, there's an element of that is a very, very huge and central part of Twin Peaks, and like Cooper's character is the kind of central character, and it's
Yes.
hard to ignore that.
Yeah, it's interesting. They just came out with the cover art today for the third season Blu-ray, which interestingly, I guess the return was just the Showtime marketing gimmick. Like David Lynch doesn't call it that, so it's like never going to be called that again. Apparently, it's just Twin Peaks season 3. But the cover art is obviously Cooper one half. It's sort of like, I don't know if do you have the entire mystery Blu-ray for Twin Peaks?
No.
It's a picture of Laura's portrait, but there's like a hole in the cover and you can see the corpse wrapped in plastic underneath. It's like
Mm.
splintered and fragmented. So this is a sort of a similar idea. It's Cooper, but one half of it's sort of divided down the middle by a very sharp zigzag, and one side is Mr. C and the other side is Cooper slash Dougie, the good Cooper. And so it's interesting. Like, well, there's a whole other question we could sort of delve into, and maybe we will later, but of how this relates to what Fire Walk With Me does with Twin Peaks and what the original series is pitched as, blah, 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 blah. But I think The Return is definitely Cooper's struggle and his story. And I think what I'm sort of struggling with now is the question of was this necessary in some way? I think no matter what, I love this series for being new Lynch material and just doing all these interesting things. And so it's already a success for me on that front. But I've also got sort of a vested interest in Twin Peaks as a whole, as a singular kind of work with a unusual approach, but that, up till now, it took you from the pilot through Fire Walk With Me. So my question that I'm intrigued to dig into over the next few months or even the next year is, this is Cooper's story. What does it tell us about him that maybe we couldn't already deduce from the season 2 finale? What new material does it sort of add to that? And I feel like there are probably some things. I'm sort of on the fence right now as to what I think those are and how it works. I have a feeling that if The Return is an essential new piece of Twin Peaks, it's centered around the Dougie material somehow, even though that seems in some ways like the most lighthearted and sort of, it was something people kept waiting for it to end, which was hilarious to me because I knew pretty early on. This is the core of the series. This isn't going.
Yeah.
But people kept saying every week, this is it. The baseball woke him up. This woke him up. The sex woke him up. It was it was pretty funny.
I thought for a while, but when it reaches a certain point at the end, when he was as far as especially episodes 16 and 17, I pretty much, I know some people were like, oh, I thought he was never going to win. I knew it was going to happen. I knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, something happened. But I knew that it wouldn't be until the final stretch. Once I sort of saw what they were setting up with that, it was like, I knew it wouldn't be till the final third and probably the final few. But I suspect whatever's essential, like the way that the finale is, the way that the reveal is essential for telling us that, Leland killed and abused Laura, and the way that the finale is central for showing us Cooper's downfall, and the way that the Fire Walk With Me is essential for positioning Laura as the center of this and making her subjectivity an actual thing. If The Return has anything like that, I think it has to do with Cooper expanding on what we know from the finale, but maybe adding something new to it too. And I'm not yet sure what that new thing is, but I think it might be there.
I think it's there. I don't think I can say exactly what it is, but I guess one thing that occurred to me, when I was watching through the series for the first time, I went back and forth for a while, and it took me until maybe the last several episodes, maybe the last 4 episodes. I think the point where I decided that I actually really did like the series and was completely on board was the beginning of the episode where Nadine walks up to Big Ed and she's like, I've been a real bitch.
Yeah.
and like that, because that was just something really, I don't know, that I guess it was sort of fan service, but it was it was fan service in a way that felt sort of weirdly appropriate.
Yeah, we needed something like that.
And that really launched a bunch of other things that happened in that episode that I felt like were, really got me on board permanently. But when I was watching it, for the first many episodes, I sort of kept feeling like David Lynch really just wants to keep reminding us that Twin Peaks is not a good place. And he just really wants to hammer it over our heads over and over again, because it just felt like every scene in Twin Peaks, it was always something bad happening. And I think that was kind of the overwhelming perception that I had. And I had again, while watching this, the really strange divide between the world of Twin Peaks and like the Las Vegas sort of stuff.
Mm.
Because Twin Peaks is like the dark stuff happens in Twin Peaks in this series, but there's also a lot of kind of just goofy and fun stuff. And in the return, it's just it's like 80% just I don't know, it just felt like everything was going wrong in the world of Twin
Mm.
Peaks and everything was sort of at its seams and there's just something really wrong about it. And it made me think about when I was rewatching um the sort of dynamic of like it's hard for me to think about the series without thinking about like, America in 2017,
Mm-hmm.
like and specifically sort of ideas of like poverty and drug addiction and stuff that affect communities like Twin
Mm.
Peaks, um, in that like these are places where that are very kind of unstable, that aren't really sort of keeping themselves together, and yet there's also this kind of boiling sort of hatred and resentment against um, and I mean, it really sort of came out to me with the Dr. Jacoby, Alex Jones stuff, that there's just like this boiling resentment against this kind of establishment or these establishment figures, which could be or people from the outside who don't necessarily really understand what's happening in these places. Who, for me, was really represented by like the FBI and Cooper specifically.
Mm.
Of Cooper, who's coming in as somebody who kind of sees this small town as this nice place where nothing bad ever happens, and he doesn't really actually understand the kind of maybe some of the root of you know he doesn't actually really understand what these places are and what's actually happening in them to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, well, people have pointed out a lot. We're seeing like Twin Peaks without Cooper, kind of, which is an interesting way to kind of look at it. Like, maybe this is more what it is, not through his sort of eyes. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting too. You bring that up because I was just on the podcast Discourse Collective, and they were kind of drawing a similar conclusion about that. This sort of like this representation of poverty and Twin Peaks and how that relates to sort of where especially like a lot of like rural America is in 2017 versus in 1990, yeah, it's interesting too, and I feel like this is a good point to bring in Mark Frost as well, because I think a lot of that too may have to do with Frost.
Hmm.
I think he sometimes has a more overt political bent in some of his work, and certainly on his like Twitter and stuff like that. Um, so it would be interesting to kind of dig into that and see sort of what each of them kind of brought to that, and how they kind of made it relevant. I don't know if I have anything more to add than that, but yeah, I appreciate those thoughts. They're interesting, and I feel like there's something that I was sort of semi-conscious of while watching the show, but there were so many other things that I was sort of thinking about that it's something that's sort of arising more almost in retrospect. And it's interesting too, because in my mind I sort of saw there were two possibilities of where Twin Peaks could go in this series, I thought. And one of them was that it's become sort of this gentrified tourist hotspot.
Well,
And the other, yeah, well, the
yeah,
other was that it's actually become totally run down and like a meth haven and all this stuff. And the interesting thing is they kind of did both,
yeah,
Like
exactly.
they actually kind of incorporated both elements in there.
Because like the Roadhouse,
Yeah.
like I mean that was my first impression. When I watched it, it's like, oh, the Roadhouse is
Yeah.
filled with hipsters. Because like why else would the Chromatics be playing at the Roadhouse?
Yeah.
Like that. But speaking of that, I think like also having rewatched the series, I appreciate the musical numbers so much. I think they're
Mhm.
they're a big reason why I think that like if there's one reason why I'm happy the show exists, that's definitely one of the biggest
Yeah.
reasons. And I didn't feel that way, watching it first. It felt kind of awkward,
Yeah.
but I think the more that you get into the series, well, first of all, like I think the thing that made me really realize that the songs were reflecting the narrative themes was when Eddie Vedder was playing the
Mm,
song, about different versions of yourself, and like this, that you can't ever really be anything more than what you are, and that like this kind of like struggling, wanting this different life that you've never had, and you have to sort of admit that that isn't really something that you've
mm.
ever had, and this fantasy isn't, can't be maintained or whatever, and that happens immediately preceding sort of Audrey
Yeah,
breaking out of
definitely.
some sort of fantasy. And going back, a lot of the songs reference either dreaming or people not remembering things that happened in the past. Like there's a lot of references to
Yeah.
like, I don't remember, and there's a lot of dialogue that references that too. So I think like, and this is something Lynch said himself, like the real core of the theme of the series was this feeling of not really, like you're sort of, you're occupying, I guess it's like being in a state of being where you're sort of, like in, you're occupying yourself, but you're not yourself. Like things
Hmm.
have changed and you don't remember the past,
Hmm.
and the future has sort of changed in this way that is very strange, and it doesn't feel real. Like
Hmm.
there's something unreal about it, um, and like slowly coming to terms with the fact that there is something, that you haven't acknowledged. Maybe the reason that this is happening are there things that you haven't acknowledged or you haven't sort of been able to deal with. Like the world is decaying in a way because you're not yourself.
Hmm. Now, you're saying? Did you say that Lynch said this, or that you see him sort of
Well,
expressing this? Like,
he said he said that the series was about returning.
uh,
I think it was something about like returning to, after sort of returning to something after a long time
interesting.
away, or like finding, kind of discovering a new form of yourself or whatever. I can't remember
Yeah,
exactly what he
I know
said.
there was one where he said, in relation to Cooper, like it's coming into the world and finding the things that you like and everything like that. Um, but just the general thought of what you're saying, I think is really interesting. Um,
For me,
this
that,
idea of almost,
go ahead.
I don't know what the exact, it's not dissociation, but it's like something else where you're sort of feeling, well, maybe the word will come to me, but anyways, yeah, sorry, keep going.
Well, it's, yeah, this feeling like you're not really processing the things that are happening around. Like there's all this like sort of trauma around you that you're not really able um, to deal with. And in the world of Twin Peaks, that's very obvious. But then in the world of Las Vegas, those things suddenly just magically work out
Mm,
via, like these Deus Ex Machinas
mm,
that consistently happen. And I mean, like, that was the other thing that I hated about the new series for a long time, and I think I'm starting to understand, was that I just hated Evil Cooper as a character.
mm.
Not because
Interesting.
he, not because he was a bad guy, I mean, that's
Yeah.
obvious, but because he was a boring antagonist, because he was all powerful.
Mm,
Like, anything, like there's one thing that doesn't make any sense to me, and it's still like I realize how little this any of it makes sense. The like Evil Cooper trying to assassinate Dougie,
hmm.
like the different sort of plot threads and like all that, that revolve around different people trying to assassinate him. Like like it's so absurd, like the fact that he's hiring like all these hitmen to take care of Dougie, and then they don't, and then he kills them. I get he But like, how is he doing all these sort of
Hmm.
machinations, behind the scenes? And then if you accept that he's doing all these things, what does that really mean? Like, does that really just totally take the whole purpose of the story to say that like Cooper, he's either a really good or a really evil guy, and he can magically do these things because why not? Like, what does that really mean for the world of the story? Like, what is that doesn't really say anything. That's sort of like
Hmm.
that's what I call it's like what I think of as like the Harry Potter situation where you have a character that becomes kind of so popular and so sort of all powerful that they can just kind of do anything, and they kind of cease to be human after a certain point. Um, and I felt that way, with Cooper, and with evil Cooper, and with Dougie. Like, the reason it works is just because like it's kind of played for laughs,
Hmm.
um, but
Hmm.
there's something and I mean, I think that the black and white nature of the two Coopers is reflected by Cooper himself seeing things in black and white.
Yeah.
um
Interesting.
and there's this sort of things that are obviously horrible, um that but don't really like. There's a one scene where Richard Horn is robbing his mom, um, or no, his grandmother, like his grandmother's house, and like Johnny Horn is like kind of tied up, and there's this like
Hmm.
weird doll saying, "Hello, Johnny, how are you today?" Um, and like that scene has like this bizarre like music it playing during it. Like, it has this like really kind of almost like happy and joyous seeming music. It's kind of like a scene from like Clockwork Orange or something.
Mm.
Uh, um but it just seems totally at odds, because other scenes where bad stuff happens, it plays, dark evil music, but that scene, it's kind of like it's not a funny scene.
Mm.
The fact that that's played kind of, the scene just seems so ridiculous, like and it just kind of emphasizes how much of an over the top character Richard Horn is, and it kind of how much he doesn't feel particularly real. That kind of evil doesn't feel particularly
Yeah,
real.
I don't know how. I think Richard is one of the. There's a lot of stuff in the series that maybe I struggled with, or this or that, but I've kind of come to accept in some way. I'm not sure if Richard really works, and I have some thoughts about that that are kind of like, there. I always kind of have fun sort of speculating and thinking what happened behind the scenes, blah blah blah. So I I'm not totally sure what Richard really achieves in the narrative, or like why he's there kind of and I think Eamon Ferris, or the actor, I think he does an amazing job. Like, I think he's really good in that part. And the scenes are well directed and they're disturbing and everything. But looking back on it now from the vantage point of everything else, I'm not sure, and I may come to different conclusions. I think it is interesting that Cooper's referred to in that letter in the final episode as Richard. Um, and the giant says Richard and Linda and everything. So
Yeah.
maybe there's
Well,
something to dig into there, but
there is a Linda that appears in the series in like
yeah,
a guy mentions that
yeah.
his like Aunt Linda is like is in a wheel is trying to get like benefits or something, and
Does he
he's in a
say
wheelchair.
his aunt? Because for some reason I thought it was his wife,
Oh,
but I don't
I don't
know if
think
he actually
it might have
says.
been it
And
might have been his
so I
wife.
actually read speculation. People are saying maybe that's going to be Annie's daughter, and Richard and Linda are not twins, but they're children of the different Coopers, and they're going to come together.
Yeah,
So yeah, there was all
that
this
didn't happen.
anticipation, and then Richard just got fried, and Bad Cooper was like, goodbye, my son, and that was it. And so at that point, I was kind of like, don't know if Richard really, and it feels funny to say this about Twin Peaks because you kind of accept that it's sprawling and that Lynch has all these little sketches he's drawing here and there, and you kind of almost can't, you can question if you want, but if you get something from it and if it does something interesting, you kind of accept that it's there. Like this was like Twin Peaks with the missing pieces left in, That's kind of the nature of the return. So it sounds funny in that context, but I kind of can't help feeling Richard didn't really need to be there, and I'm not sure what he added.
Well,
Plus, it's already there with other characters and situations. And I do have a thought on that that's totally speculatory, but I'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to me about the return echoing the structure of Mulholland Drive in that, like, I think there's an element that isn't. I don't know if it's exactly a dream space or something, but it's much more sort of psychological and like I think we have to question whether things that are happening are really happening to some degree in the story, especially when it's been so many years after the original story. It almost seems odd to want to revisit it when, like the original story has kind of been resolved. So maybe the whole purpose of revisiting it was to show that revisiting it wasn't possible in a way, or like, that you can't really ever go back. I don't know. I think that's something that like definitely needs to be thought about, when rewatching the series.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that too, and it sort of ties into what I was saying about, was this a necessary part of Twin Peaks, or did this, even if it's just good on its own terms, does it add something new? And it's like, so for me, I have a kind of a problem if our takeaway from the return ends up being telling us sort of like, well, you kind of can't go back to Twin Peaks again, and by coming back, we're actually pointing to Firewalk with Me and saying, no, this is the center. You're kind of wrong for even wanting the story and blah, blah, blah. I mean, on one level, I can appreciate that because I do think Firewalk with Me is like, key and the greatest part of Twin Peaks and all of that. But it wasn't like they had to make this series. They chose to go make it. So it almost feels like a weird self-fulfilling prophecy. So I need I need something more to kind of justify it for me, because if it's just about its own sort of pointlessness, not, in a narrative, what does it bring to Twin Peaks sense, then I think I kind of see it as a little bit too self-referential. Like it's, other parts of Twin Peaks like had to be made certain ways because of outside circumstances or whatever, and the material responds to that in interesting ways. But this was something that they themselves chose to do. You know what I mean?
Well, there are still outside circumstances though when you think about it, because like Lynch couldn't get any
That's
film
true.
funded
I've heard people
after, and like
out.
the like his opportunity to do the new series was probably predicated on the fact that it was Twin Peaks. Like if he was doing a new series, it would, like an entirely new TV series, it would have, a fraction of the attention paid to it. So I do think that that's a factor. And like, if you're thinking about it, from the perspective of someone who's an artist who wants to make a statement about something and has to kind of use what hands they've been dealt, I think it's not out of the question to think about it in that way. Because, even David Lynch, although his work seems, to be this wonderful, self-contained, beautiful work, I think there's kind of and I'm sure David Lynch wants it to be seen that way in some ways. There's kind of a fallacy there because it is inevitably the work made by a person affected by the conditions in which they were making the work. And as much as David Lynch has tried to live in his own universe, it's impossible. Like culture on the outside has affected him and his films and the things that he's made immensely. And I think maybe Twin Peaks, this new Twin Peaks is one of the first things that I've seen that's actually tried to reconcile that. Like, and there has been more stuff about, current day culture and stuff in
Hmm.
Twin Peaks, and maybe that's part of his artistic evolution is acknowledging that, that it isn't that it can't be this entirely self-contained universe
Hmm.
or whatever. That there has to be um, something coming in from outside of it. I don't know. So that's something to think about, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's something. I think that question and that understanding of what both how it functions as a unit unto itself and also how it functions within the larger context of Twin Peaks are sort of going to be things that I will be exploring quite a bit, I think, in upcoming work, just kind of grappling with that. Now, actually, one thing to go back and rewind, because I kind of forgot about it, but the Richard thing, I just wanted to throw this idea out there. I do think I get this sense, a strong sense from Sherilyn Fenn's interviews and from rumors at the time that she didn't like what they had written for her and that possibly what we've seen was a rewrite that both solves that problem and actually kind of metatextually addresses that problem in the show itself, which I find really intriguing. I don't know if that's the case. It's sort of guesswork at this point, but it does make me wonder as well if maybe the material she was in was like more related to Richard. Like maybe when he comes in and attacks Sylvia, this is totally speculatory again. Maybe that was supposed to be Audrey, and like maybe that was like one of her only few scenes or something, and
Mm.
she was just like so. It's
Well,
interesting.
it's hard to speculate on
Yeah,
that kind
it's
of stuff
totally like
because
I want to keep qualifying that this is just me trying to piece together clues, but it makes me wonder if Richard's story was supposed to go somewhere a little bit different and have more to do with Audrey and all of that. And so therefore part of the reason he seems like a dead end in the narrative is because that aspect of his role was sort of cut short by those circumstances. Again,
well, I
don't
it's
know,
hard
but
for
I'm intrigued.
it's hard to make that excuse, I think, because of how much creative control that they have. Like I feel like you kind of just have to look at what's there
Yeah,
and assume that
to
it
a
was
certain.
intended to be there.
Yeah, and I think whether or not it's intended to be, they would not make something. They would come to a like Lynch would come to a place where he was happy with what he was doing, even if it wasn't the hand that he was originally wanted to be dealt or something.
Yeah,
But
yeah, just with
I am
like
just intrigued because I do like that behind the scenes kind of. I like to know the hand he was dealt as well as the way he dealt
yeah.
it. I have that
I
sort of interest.
Yeah, I think there is a thing though that it can distract from what the actual thing is there. I mean, you kind of like I think it's important to separate out from what was completed in with that other stuff as much as possible. Just
I
because
yeah. Keep going. Sorry.
I just because that's what he's
Yeah.
that's what he's put there, and like I don't know. I mean, I feel the same way about the missing pieces with Firewalk with Me, which I'm like I love to see those scenes,
Yeah.
but I'm also very glad that they were cut out.
Yeah. Me too.
Um,
And knowing
but
that people, made fan edits and stuff, which I just, I think that's
yeah,
missing the point to a certain extent, unless it's just a totally intellectual exercise to kind of see, oh, this was there and whatever.
yeah.
Actually, I
What
wanted to
was I
just
gonna?
sort of comment because I do agree with you to a certain extent. And I think Lynch definitely agrees with you because he always says, like with Mulholland Drive, like forget about the pilot, like this is the movie. Don't even try to find out what was in the pilot. It doesn't matter, et cetera, et cetera. For me, it's a little different. And I think actually learning some of the context has actually helped me understand certain things in different ways. I think particularly with Firewalk with Me. Um, and I do think you're right. You have to tread with caution with this stuff, and you have to not give it too much importance. However, with Firewalk with Me, I think it's interesting to learn to what extent he added certain things during the production, and how that was like contingent upon, particularly like Cheryl Lee's um, wishes for the character and sort of observing her throw herself into this performance. And to
Yeah.
me, that's sort of it's shown an interesting perspective, not just on Firewalk with Me, but also Inland Empire, which I feel is, among other things, sort of reflects that experience of working with her on Firewalk with Me.
Yeah, well, so a thing with Inland Empire
Mm-hmm.
that I also, because I mean, I agree with you that, that stuff can be valuable. I just don't think it should necessarily come into play when we're talking about like plot
Mm-hmm.
interpretations
Yeah,
or,
fair enough.
things like that. Especially with something like Twin Peaks: The Return, where he definitely had, as much creative control as anyone could have probably in
Yeah,
that situation.
definitely.
But the thing I was going to say about I think I saw I don't know how recently this was. I think it was for the Criterion DVD of Mulholland Drive, but I saw some clips online. First of all, there was one fairly long interview with Lynch and Naomi Watts and some other people about the making of Mulholland Drive, and there was also some clips
Mm-hmm.
during filming. And during the clips of filming, like Naomi Watts is really kind of struggling with the scenes, and she's just kind of saying like "fuck," I can't remember that line,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And she said in the interview that her career was really struggling, and
Mm.
that she was in a really kind of difficult place and just kind of tired of being passed over. And that's something that is like you see directly kind of
Yeah.
referenced in the plot of Mulholland Drive,
Yeah.
but also like she is like obviously really struggling with the character and doing the scenes that she's doing, and David Lynch is trying to encourage her and being like, just hang in there and all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
But I think that kind of watching this actress go through, these really kind of harrowing scenes,
Mm.
particularly, with Cheryl Lee, also with
Yeah.
like Laura Dern, also in, Laura Dern's and Naomi Watts stuff, definitely like influenced the direction of his work, particularly with Mulholland Drive
Yeah.
and Inland Empire.
Yeah.
But because it like that's literally what Inland Empire is about, is like
Yeah.
this kind of actress.
Well, let me ask you, what do you think? What was your take on Diane in Twin Peaks: The Return? Because that's a character that seems to have been almost more controversial than I would have expected in terms of people not liking the direction she's taken and stuff like that. And
I don't know. It's like I guess this kind of adds to my feeling like we can't take what is happening on the screen like at each moment literally,
hmm
because it contradicts itself so
mm,
many times, and it seems to do so in a way that is like calling attention to the fact that it's contradicting itself. I don't know, like it's difficult. It's I mean, I think like Laura Dern did a great job, obviously.
hmm
I mean, she's an amazing actress, but I really think of like Diane as like kind of the character that is like Cooper's. It kind of maybe exposes that Cooper isn't such this great guy that we think that he is necessarily. Like maybe he did really fuck up and with her, and like his treatment of her is in a particular way that kind of denies her a certain sort of agency
mm,
or whatever, and that inevitably maybe leads her to leave and kind of disappear at the end of the story, because she's never really handled in a way that's by him that is like respectful or whatever. It just like, I mean, the other thing is like David Lynch's treatment of, well, I mean, I guess we can get into this in general. Like David Lynch's treatment of gender and race, and those are things that people talk about a lot as things that leave something to be desired.
hmm
Um, And I think it's true. Like specifically, I mean, I think he has directed films that are, can be considered very feminist. I love Inland Empire especially, um, but he has a very particularly like binary view of gender,
Mm,
and
definitely,
and
yeah.
yeah, and for me as somebody who's I'm trans, like that is something that it's hard for me to watch and not think about.
Hmm.
And with something and like so that's something that I think is reflected by Lynch and is also reflected by Cooper. And I think maybe Cooper's downfall is the way that he doesn't see that his fate is connected to that of like female characters, that
Mm,
he sees himself as this protector sort of outside of it, and he sees himself and these kind of like and the whole like Bookhouse Boys thing, like that is somehow, those male protectors are somehow separate from the female victims. The fact that
mm,
those things can't somehow come together, and I think that that is like a large part of his downfall for me, and maybe that is somewhat comes to the surface with the new series, but also like his treatment of race is something that I feel like it's also worth discussing because he just generally ignores the issue.
yeah.
Um, but there are times, that people mentioned, like the woodsman spirits kind of looking like they were blackface.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like it is interesting to think about because I think of those spirits as being kind of the same entity as like the homeless guy in Mulholland Drive.
Hmm.
And if you like really think about what the homeless guy in Mulholland Drive means, it's this sort of fear of the main character, or it's this sort of fear of acknowledging this kind of abject sort of poverty or suffering, or like this fear of being sort of not able to control your trauma and being in a situation where you're kind of left behind by society, or you don't have a voice or
Hmm.
something. Like you're not this glamorized, idealized sort of portrait, of that like the women in David Lynch's films are in particular. So um, I think, and in a way that's sort of representative of the experience of marginalized people, particularly like people of color, and that sort of they sort of there's some sort of dealing with that a little bit in Inland Empire, although there's still issues with that. But I think like the fact that the I think like those kind of spirits are kind of like boogeymen in a way.
Hmm.
Like they're a fear. They're reflective of a fear, and they're reflective of a fear, maybe that like white America has about
Hmm.
Black America, or about acknowledging a certain kind of trauma, or about that. So I think like
That's a
I
great
think
point.
it,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's something that is really embodied in his work, I feel like.
Hmm.
So it's kind of hard to look at his work in a way that, like these issues are present, but you don't know what exactly David Lynch's position on
Yeah.
them is, I guess. And it's more complicated than other directors, so it's hard to just dismiss it outright. But I think it's valuable to think about this stuff too, because it does show that like um there's something like missing in his movies, but
Hmm.
maybe it's like stuff like Twin Peaks The Return is calling attention to some of the things that are missing in his universe too. So I don't know.
Well, it's funny
I don't
because the or sorry, keep going.
no, no, I was just gonna ask you what you thought about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really, you made a lot of really interesting points, and I think the gender aspect in his work, it's extremely highlighted. And like you said, there's very much like the sort of this binary at play where he's not even just sort of talking about men and women in general. He's like coding it in a very specific way where it's the masculine problems are a specific set of problems and the feminine problems are a specific set of problems. and sort of using that almost allegorically, but also embedding it in an actual characters who are defined as male or female. You know what I mean? So it's like I can see how that would be kind of problematic in that sense. What's interesting with race is he doesn't foreground it at all. Certainly in the way of gender, it's almost sort of this absence, and therefore those sort of manifestations where, like you're talking about, the woodsmen being sort of almost looking like they're in blackface or whatever, and representing this sort of primal fear of this sort of 50s white Americana or whatever, of like, the outside intruder, and racially coding that, but then also dissociating it from any explicit racial coding, because it's sort of several steps removed from that, just in a variety of ways. But it's interesting because that makes me think, that's an episode that's referencing so many different movies, and that makes me think quite a bit of Birth of a Nation, which in a totally non-ironic way, or non-self-conscious way, is positioning itself as this movie about white America threatened by the basically black America, and doing so through this extremely exaggerated, unintentionally exaggerated use of blackface, of like white characters literally just making themselves up in covering themselves in like black face paint, and grimacing, and just in this sort of like inhuman, very dehumanizing way and everything. So that's sort of interesting to consider, especially because in Lynch's work, a lot of times it's a sort of a more ambivalent presentation of this sort of idealized America being threatened by the external eerie forces. You get a sense that he's actually kind of ambivalent about what that means, in terms of if it's just this. I think his earlier work is very much defined more in terms of a binary, where you have like good guy protects, from the world, from the bad guy
Yeah.
in Dune, and even Blue Velvet starts to blur it a little bit. Wild at Heart opens up some cracks in it, and then I think Twin Peaks starts with that dynamic and then blows it wide open by the time it gets to Firewalk with Me. Totally subverts that. So the return is interesting. I don't know if I'm answering any of these questions you've raised, but just kind of like exploring them in real time as we talk about them. But it's interesting that the return, in some sense, in some ways, sort of rolls back the clock on some of the things that we see sort of advancing in Lynch's understanding and the complexity of the work. And then at the end, maybe asks us, maybe positions it in a way where whether or not he's doing that quote unquote on purpose, it contextualizes it in a way where it maybe makes some sense of why that's happening and how that relates to the earlier work, if that
Well,
makes
yeah.
sense.
So, yeah, yeah. Well, like in Blue Velvet, the bad things go away at the end of the movie, and
Yeah.
like there's birds chirping, and everything is fine.
Yes.
And even in Twin Peaks that happens, and some of that
Mm.
was not David Lynch.
Yeah, I think that's the whole key, isn't it? It's like episode 14 pivots him away from that, and episode 16 reasserts that dynamic without him present for it. And that's where
But
everything cracks, kind of.
but you have to think that maybe he's addressing that or commenting on that in some way, because that is Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
Just because it's not him doesn't mean it's not, because there are things at least a few things from those episodes that he didn't direct that he's referenced.
Right.
Like people mentioned the glowing sound effect
Hmm.
in the lodge being a thing that comes up
Yeah.
at in some random season 2 episode that he didn't direct. Um, so I think and after that work, you see things where like once the darkness is opened up, there isn't someone to come and save everything, and the world isn't, necessarily made a better place by, these things being solved. In fact, it might actually be the opposite, and this person might actually be, if not the antagonist, then someone who is not necessarily coming in with good intentions. And I think at the end of the day, that's sort of where Twin Peaks: The Return leaves us, um, in that sort of like, we're not necessarily in the place where we've been able to get through a lot of the trauma and fucked up stuff and out the other end in the way that like Inland Empire, or Fire Walk with Me has kind of a happy-ish ending.
Hmm.
Um, so it just, the fact that it's opening it up, it's going back, and then it's the fact that it's going back to a lot of those tropes, and then it's opening it up at the end and
Yeah.
saying like, hey, this is actually not so great, I think shows the
Hmm.
difference between what Twin Peaks of before and David
Yeah.
Lynch of before and David Lynch now, and it definitely plants him in, David Lynch of the past, 15 or 20
Yeah.
years. So I don't know. I think like, especially after uh, watching over the new series, I just think it is a really special thing. And while I can't like intellectually explain exactly why I think things that are there are important or valuable, I think that they are, and I think it's apparent, the more that you spend time with other things,
Mm.
just how much is kind of like left out, how much of is not left out and not dealt with in other works of art that are dealt with in one way or another, in David Lynch's work and Twin Peaks in general. And I think, I guess my hope is that, and maybe this is being too hopeful, is that there will be more works of art like this, and there will be more people in the future who will expand some of the territory of David Lynch's work
Yeah.
into something else, because there really aren't that many people out there like that, if any at all. Um, and it's hard to think of a world without David Lynch. You know,
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too because I think you're right. Like there needs to be something of like the spirit of Lynch, and I think part of the problem with when people talk about Lynchian and this and that, it's often sort of taking, I don't want to say superficial aspects because they're important aspects of his work, but they're sort of like the stylistic ticks or something. And I think what needs to happen and will be more interesting eventually when it does happen is people taking what's actually at the core of his work and then filtering that through their own sensibility or understanding so that it doesn't feel like it's like a Lynch pastiche or trying to knock him off, but yet it's got something of that spirit of expressing certain like ideas and feelings, um, and following maybe perhaps something of a dream logic without necessarily doing so in the exact same way that he does.
well, yeah. I mean, to go back to this, that's what I really liked about your video with Fire Walk with Me, and your videos about Twin Peaks in general,
Hmm.
is that you identify the issues in David Lynch's work about their core. That the fact is their core are things that are very
Yeah.
real and very relevant, and they're very. I mean, and this is something also in like that Naomi Watts was saying in that Mulholland Drive interview, was that she felt like the most important thing uh, to David Lynch for her when she was acting was truth, like getting at some sort of
Mm.
truth. And that's something that is like lost when you're talking about all the sort of puzzles and
Yeah.
obfuscations and weird things that he does in his movies. But like you think about it, and like, yeah, he's directing a movie about, like with Mulholland Drive, he's directing a movie about Hollywood that deals with, the really fucked up things that actually happen in Hollywood, in a way that is kind of way more honest and real than, oftentimes a lot of things that purport to be about reality, but are often just way more fantasy than that. And I think that can kind of get forgotten when people talk about his work because they think about all the craziness and not understanding what's going on,
Mm.
and like the imagery and stuff, and they don't get that the whole point of it is to use that to get to the core of something. And yeah, I really, I mean, it's a difficult thing to do artistically. I really hope that more people in the future are able to use the sort of tools and things that he's opened up, um, and expand them, because I don't know, it's just, like I said, being such a huge fan of his work, and particularly his later stuff, it just makes me aware of how little stuff there is out there else like it.
Yeah, I agree. I hope the same thing.
Um, Okay, let's see if I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to talk about before we finish up. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about with the new series?
Um, I don't know. I mean, like I said, there's so much you could go on forever. But
Yeah.
I mean,
So go ahead.
I'm intrigued by the sort of the Diane question, which we got into a little bit, just because I've been having a lot of conversations about that online, and just sort of surprised to see that people really just felt like that wasn't handled well. But I almost feel like that, and especially like the way it also sort of touches on Laura Dern's performance in Empire and everything, it's almost like too much of a can of worms to open up at this point. It would be like another hour of just discussing that. So I think we kind of covered it well enough for now.
Yeah, I just, in general, with a lot of those details, I don't feel comfortable really. I mean, I can say what my impressions were,
Yeah.
but now having, yeah, but like now having watched through the series, I don't, I'm not as attached to my emotional reaction, and
Mm,
I think I'm trying to understand the place that they occupy within the entirety of the series. So
interesting. Yeah.
things, yeah, so things that seem like kind of weird or out of place now are starting to, like, become things that I understand more as, like, okay, this is part of the piece. What is this piece trying to say? Independent of my emotions about that. And like, I mean, I think I had complicated feelings about but Diane, but I wasn't dismissive. I mean, I didn't have that feeling of, like, really not liking her. Maybe just because I was happy that Laura Dern was
Yeah.
in the series at all. But I don't know. I just it's complicated.
Yeah.
I think when you're talking about Diane, you also have to talk about something that many of my friends had also observed, in that there are so many women that are basically hysterical at various points in the series,
Mm,
and that is like a very common occurrence of, like, women being kind of like just on the edge and freaking out, and with, like, um, Sheriff Truman's wife, and um, to a point where it almost seems unnecessary. And that's kind of what makes me think that maybe this is part of a larger thing,
yeah.
you know, and that it can't just be read in the way of, like, well, David Lynch sees all these women as hysterical, because it doesn't. There's so many, like, there's like, if you want to do that, like, if you want to look at all the plot details and try and understand how they make sense within the world of the thing, like, there's so many of them just don't make any sense. Like, because you could ask literally that question. The question that you were asking about Richard Horn, I feel like
Yeah.
you could ask that question about a lot of things in this series, and that's what's making me be like, okay, well, this is why I need to understand what's going on, because, like I said, the Cooper assassination plot stuff doesn't make any sense to me either. Like, it just seems stupid
Mhm.
to me. Like, and there's a lot of the series that seems like that, and because of that, like, you could try and go and look at the individual pieces and try and understand how they might make sense. But I think it's really important to try and look at the larger picture and that there might be something else going on here that, we're missing right now. And,
Hmm.
it's only a week or so after the finale, so I'm sure people will start to piece that together. But that's just something that I want to put out there. But I mean, I'll really look forward to your videos and things that you're doing in the future, because I'm sure that there will be much heated discussion about this series for a pretty long time.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, just as an aside, um, as somebody who has been really into Lynch's work for the past 10 years, I only just got aware of him when Inland Empire came out, and that movie wasn't exactly
Hmm.
popular. So there being a new David Lynch work where everyone is talking about it, everyone's seeing it, and I mean, certainly there are people who aren't, but like a work that is so bizarre and strange and has so many different things going on and that so many people are talking about and so many people are kind of trying to break apart is really sort of just fabulous to me. I'm like super overjoyed about that. So I guess at the end of the day, I think that this last summer and, the whole series has been a really special thing, even if nothing else happens.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that it wasn't something I ever really expected until it happened, you know. I thought maybe he was retired and that was it. And now the only thing left is I hope he makes. I mean, Inland Empire is a great last film, magnum opus, if that's what it is. But part of me just selfishly hopes he'll make another feature film so I can actually see a Lynch film for the first time in a theater, as it's
Yeah.
released, because I've never had that experience yet. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But this was a pretty good, you know, this was pretty great to experience this way.
Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciated the conversation, and also your posts have been great, and I'm sure will continue to be great.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. This was a great conversation. Really, like, got to explore so many different things, and it was, hopefully, maybe at some point we can do it again, and when there's sort of more down the road, and we have, I don't know, you'll never have a full grasp on it, but we have more of sort of a sense maybe of where we've been.
Yeah, totally. I would love to talk more, especially when you get into doing your
Yeah,
series
definitely.
on the return. Yeah, and like your blog, lostinthemovies.com, correct?
Yes.
And you're also Lost in the Movies on Twitter.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So definitely check Joel out on either of those things. Thank you so much for coming on again. This has been a really great conversation. And yeah, I hope to have another conversation with you some point in the future.
Sounds